My brother laughed in my face loudly enough for the entire patio to hear. He told our extended family that I was a failure who could not even afford a car. He had no idea that a few hours later a private helicopter would descend from the sky and land right in the middle of my parents' perfectly manicured lawn. When the wind knocked over their expensive party tents and I told him my ride had arrived, my mother collapsed in a dead faint. To understand the sheer panic on their faces, you have to know what they tried to do to me first. The annual family barbecue at my parents' estate in suburban Atlanta was always less of a gathering and more of a theatrical performance. My parents, Jerome and Vivian, treated these events like a stage to showcase their accumulated wealth in social standing. The backyard was massive, featuring a pristine swimming pool, a custom outdoor kitchen, and perfectly manicured hedges that separated us from the neighbors. I stood near the edge of the patio, holding a simple paper plate loaded with brisket and potato salad. I had arrived 30 minutes earlier, taking a rideshare from the airport after wrapping up a week of intense meetings. I am 35 years old and the founder of a multi-million-dollar freight and logistics firm. But to my family, I am just Kendra the disappointment. I wore a simple olive green dress from Zara, not because I could not afford better, but because I valued comfort over designer labels. My brother Trevin, on the other hand, wore a linen suit that probably cost more than some people make in a month. He is 38 years old and the undisputed golden child of the Vance family. Trevin walked toward me, holding a thick stack of legal documents. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing. Without any warning, he tossed the heavy stack of papers directly onto my paper plate. The impact sent a splatter of dark barbecue sauce right across the top page and onto my hand. I stared at him in disbelief. "Sign away your percentage of Grandma's commercial lot, Kendra." He demanded, his voice carrying a tone of absolute authority. "You are practically bankrupt, and my startup needs the liquidity right now." I slowly picked up a napkin and wiped the sauce from my fingers. Our grandmother had left a prime piece of commercial real estate in downtown Atlanta to the family. I owned a 20% equity stake in it. Trevon had always viewed the property as his personal piggy bank waiting to be cracked open. He stood there looking down at me with a mixture of annoyance and superiority. "It is a favor to you, really," he continued, crossing his arms over his chest. "The property taxes are a burden you cannot afford to maintain anyway. My tech company is dealing with some minor cash flow issues, and I am restructuring. I need your share to consolidate the assets." He spoke using corporate buzzwords, hoping to confuse me. He assumed that because I started my career working in a dispatch office, I had no understanding of finance or equity. I looked down at the documents resting on top of my ruined lunch. The pages were thick with legal jargon. I did not need a law degree to know that giving up my equity was a terrible idea. I reached down and carefully pulled the stack of papers off my plate. As I wiped the remaining barbecue sauce off the top sheet, something caught my eye. The bottom right corner of the page already bore a raised seal. I stared at it for a long moment, processing what it meant. My brother was standing in front of me, demanding my signature on a document that had already been legally certified. I looked up at Trevin, keeping my voice completely calm. "Why is this already notarized, Trevin, when I have not even picked up a pen?" Before Trevin could formulate an excuse, his wife stepped into my personal space. Chloe is 32 years old and considers herself the ultimate authority on everything. She is white, comes from a wealthy family, and has always viewed my working-class roots with thinly veiled disgust. She held a crystal wine glass in one hand and pointed her perfectly manicured finger at me with the other. "Come on, Kendra," she said, deliberately, raising her voice, so the aunts and uncles gathered on the patio would turn to listen. "Tyon is building a real legacy here. You took a rideshare to get to a family barbecue, and you are wearing a dress from 3 seasons ago. Do not drag this family down just because you are struggling." I stood there absorbing her words. Chloe loved to throw around phrases like black excellence whenever it suited her narrative. She used it as a weapon to elevate Trevon and demean me. In her eyes, Trevon was the epitome of success because he ran a flashy tech startup. Even though that startup had yet to produce a single profitable quarter, I, on the other hand, was an embarrassment. I did not flinch at her insults. I had spent years dealing with her condescending remarks. Instead of responding to her provocation, I flipped to the second page of the legal documents. The text detailed a massive transfer of collateral. It was not just a simple release of equity. The document outlined a $2 million bridge loan secured against the full value of the downtown property. and right there on the signature line for the minority shareholder was my name written in handwriting that was clearly not mine. I looked back at Chloe, my expression hardening. I held the document up so she could see the forged signature. "Chloe," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the suddenly quiet patio, "does your husband's excellence usually involve committing federal wire fraud?" The color instantly drained from Chloe's face. Trevon lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers out of my hand, but I quickly stepped back. The music playing from the outdoor speakers suddenly felt far too loud. The chatter of my extended family died down completely. Before I could say another word, my mother, Vivian, marched across the lawn. Her heels sank into the grass, but she did not seem to care. Her face was contorted with fury. I expected her to question Treven. I expected her to ask why my signature had been forged on a bank document for a $2 million loan. Instead, she turned her rage entirely on me. "You always were selfish, Kendra," Vivian hissed, stopping mere inches from my face. "You love trying to ruin your brother's moments." She aggressively scolded me, pointing out my past failures as if they justified my brother's current crime. "If you had not dropped out of that prestigious pre-law program 10 years ago to drive delivery trucks, you would not be standing here begging for relevance," she shouted. "You chose a blue-collar embarrassment over the path we laid out for you. You chose to work in freight dispatch surrounded by high school dropouts. You are in no position to judge your brother." Her words were meant to cut deep. She did not know that the dispatch job she despised had taught me the logistics industry from the inside out. She did not know that my time managing delivery trucks had laid the foundation for the multi-million-dollar supply chain empire I now owned. I had kept my success a secret, tired of my family, only showing interest when money was involved. But her admission shocked me more than her insults. "You knew," I asked, staring at my mother. "You knew he forged my name." Vivian did not even have the decency to look ashamed. "It was a clerical shortcut," she reasoned, waving her hand dismissively. "Trevon's investors needed assurances quickly. He is on the verge of a massive breakthrough. You are going to sign that paper right now to ratify the document. It is your duty to protect this family." I looked past her to where my father Jerome was standing near the outdoor bar. He was the patriarch, the man who was supposed to lead with integrity. He met my gaze for a fraction of a second before looking down at his drink. He was completely complicit, silently shielding his golden son at the expense of his daughter. The betrayal settled heavy in my chest. They were perfectly willing to let me take the fall for a felony just to maintain the illusion of Trevon's success. I dropped the pen they had tried to force into my hand. It landed silently in the soft grass. I looked at my mother, then at my brother. "I am not going to prison for your golden child." The silence hung thick and heavy in the humid Georgia air. Uncle Darnell walked over to the outdoor sound system and pulled the cord. The sudden absence of the upbeat soul music left a ringing in my ears. The festive atmosphere evaporated instantly and was replaced by a suffocating tension that felt all too familiar. The entire extended family began to close in around the patio. Aunts, uncles, and cousins left their half-eaten plates on the glass tables and formed a tight circle around me. I was completely surrounded by the people who shared my blood, but they were acting like a coordinated strike team defending their most prized asset. Aunt Patrice adjusted her wide-brimmed hat and pointed a manicured finger at me. "Why do you always have to be so bitter, Kendra?" she asked, her voice dripping with disappointment. "Your brother is trying to build generational wealth. He is showing the world true black excellence, and you are standing in the way out of pure jealousy. It is shameful how you cannot just be happy for him." I looked around the circle of faces. Not a single person offered me a sympathetic glance. They were all nodding in agreement with Aunt Patrice. I felt the intense afternoon sun beating down on my shoulders, but the chill in my veins was absolute. My father, Jerome, finally stepped forward. He always played the calm and collected patriarch, but his primary job had always been shielding Treven from the consequences of his own actions. When Treven wrecked his first car in high school, my father blamed the rain. When Treven failed out of his first business venture, my father blamed the economy. Now Treven was committing fraud, and my father was blaming me. "Kendra, lower your voice," my father said, using his sternest tone. "You are making a spectacle out of a simple misunderstanding. Your brother was just trying to expedite a very complicated financial process. The investors needed assurances immediately to keep the startup afloat. It was just a clerical shortcut to keep the momentum going. Do not blow this out of proportion." I stared at the man who had raised me, genuinely horrified by his casual dismissal of a major crime. A clerical shortcut, I repeated, making sure my voice carried to the back of the crowd. Dad. He forged my signature on a bank document to secure a $2 million bridge loan. That is not a simple misunderstanding. That is federal wire fraud. I am not overreacting. If I sign this transfer document right now to cover up his forgery, I become an accessory to a felony. The federal government does not care about your definition of black excellence, and the bank will absolutely press charges when that failing tech startup defaults on the payments. Before my father could formulate another excuse, Chloe decided it was her turn to perform. She adjusted her designer sundress and buried her face in Trevon's expensive linen jacket. Her shoulders began to shake with loud, dramatic sobs. She possessed an uncanny ability to cry on command, a skill she frequently weaponized whenever she felt threatened. She looked up, her eyes miraculously dry, but her lower lip quivering perfectly. She just wants to ruin us, Trevon. Chloe cried loudly, making sure every single aunt and uncle heard her tragic performance. She wants to make us homeless. She wants to rip away the future of our unborn children just because she is envious of our lifestyle. She hates seeing us happy in a gated community while she has nothing. She is just an angry, bitter woman trying to drag us down to her level. The reaction from my family was immediate and nauseating. My own mother wrapped a comforting arm around Chloe's shoulders, soothing the woman who was actively helping her husband steal my inheritance. My aunts murmured in agreement. Dirty looks in my direction. They rushed to comfort a wealthy white woman who had never worked a hard day in her life while treating their own flesh and blood like a criminal. The dynamic was twisted but perfectly aligned with how the family had always operated. Trevon was the king, Chloe was his untouchable queen, and I was the disposable stepping stone. I stood my ground and looked directly at Chloe. I am not envious of a lifestyle funded by stolen money, Chloe, I said calmly. And I am certainly not envious of a marriage built on financial fraud. That comment shattered whatever was left of Trevon's carefully curated charm. He gently pushed Chloe aside and closed the distance between us. He stepped directly into my personal space, using his height to try and intimidate me. The charismatic smile he used to charm investors and manipulate our parents vanished completely. His eyes were cold and hard, reflecting the true arrogance of a man who had never been told no. You listen to me and you listen closely. Trevon hissed his voice, dropping to a menacing whisper that only the people closest to us could hear. You are going to pick up that pen and you are going to sign that document. You owe me this. You owe this family. You have contributed absolutely nothing of value to our legacy. I maintained eye contact, refusing to shrink away from him. The smell of smoked hickory from the grill now felt sickening. I tightened my grip on my purse, feeling the solid weight of the items inside it. I am not signing anything, I said, my voice steady and unwavering. Trevon leaned in closer, his breath hot against my face. You have no power here, Kendra, he threatened. You are a nobody. You drive delivery trucks and live a sad, lonely life. You sign that paper right now or you are cut out of this family permanently. You will not be welcome at holidays. You will not be welcome at funerals. You will not exist to us. You will be entirely alone in this world. Choose. I looked at Trevon, and then at the ring of expectant faces surrounding us. My heart beat steadily against my ribs. I did not feel fear. I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. You want me to choose between a family of frauds and my own peace of mind? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. That is the easiest choice I have ever made in my life. Being cut out of this family is not a punishment, Trevon. It is a blessing. I turned my back on him and reached for my leather tote bag resting on one of the patio chairs. I secured the strap over my shoulder and took a step toward the main driveway. Before I could take another step, my mother moved with a speed I had not seen from her in years. Vivian practically sprinted across the stone pavers to the tall wrought iron gate that led to the front of the estate. She grabbed the heavy metal bars and slammed the gate shut, sliding the deadbolt into place. She stood in front of it with her chest heaving, blocking my exit. Her eyes were wide and wild, completely devoid of any maternal warmth. You are officially dead to me, Kendra, she screamed, her voice cracking with pure rage. Do you hear me? You are banned from this house. You are banned from our lives. You will never set foot on this property again. My father stood by the outdoor kitchen, watching his wife disown their daughter without saying a single word to stop her. The aunts and uncles who had watched me grow up simply turned their heads, whispering to each other in harsh, judgmental tones. Vivian pointed a shaking finger toward the far end of the yard. If you want to act like a common laborer, you can leave like one, she spat. You are not walking out my front gates for the neighbors to see. You can leave through the muddy back alley behind the pool house. Leave through the back like the help. The sheer cruelty of her words hung in the humid air. She expected me to break down. She expected me to beg for forgiveness, to drop to my knees and apologize for disrespecting her golden child. Instead, I felt a deep, profound calm wash over me. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me and realized she held absolutely no power over my emotions anymore. I will gladly leave through the back, I said, my voice completely unfazed by her theatrics. The people you call the help are the ones who actually run this world. Mother, I am proud to walk with them. I adjusted my bag and turned away from the heavy iron gate. I began walking across the vast expanse of manicured lawn, heading toward the wooden fence behind the pool house. My heels sank slightly into the grass, but I kept my posture perfectly straight. I was walking away from a lifetime of emotional abuse, and every step felt lighter than the last. As I neared the edge of the pool, Trevon's voice rang out behind me. He let out a loud, mocking laugh. It was the sound of an arrogant man who genuinely believed he had backed his opponent into a corner and won the game. Let her walk, Mom. Trevon called out, his voice, echoing across the water. We do not even need her signature anymore. I kept walking, not giving him the satisfaction of stopping. The bank already approved the collateral transfer this morning. He bragged loudly, ensuring every single family member heard his victory. They do not care about a minority shareholder when the primary asset is secured. They just sold my debt to a private equity firm. I am fully funded, Kendra. I am untouchable. I stopped dead in my tracks. The grass beneath my feet felt completely solid. The afternoon breeze rustled the leaves of the oak trees above me. I stood perfectly still for 3 seconds, processing the magnitude of what my brother had just unknowingly confessed. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. I turned around slowly. I walked back toward the patio, closing the distance I had just covered. The family parted slightly, looking confused by my return. Trevon was standing by the outdoor bar with his arms crossed and a smug, triumphant grin plastered across his face. Chloe was practically glowing, resting her head against his shoulder again, completely reassured that her luxury lifestyle was safe. I stopped a few feet away from them. I tilted my head and looked at Trevon, feigning complete ignorance. A private equity firm bought your massive debt? Trevon, I asked, injecting just enough curiosity into my voice to feed his enormous ego. That is incredible news. You must be so relieved. What is the name of the firm? Trevon puffed out his chest, thrilled to have the opportunity to educate his blue-collar sister on high-level finance. Apex Global Holdings. He announced, his voice practically dripping with arrogance. They are a massive multinational firm. They buy up distressed assets and fund visionary tech leaders. They are restructuring my debt. They see my potential. Like I said, Kendra, I am untouchable. I reached into my leather bag. My fingers brushed past my wallet and wrapped around the smooth, cold edge of my business card case. I pulled it out and snapped it open. I did not walk over to Trevon. Instead, I stepped toward his wife. I pulled out a heavy matte black titanium business card. I tossed it onto the glass patio table, right next to Chloe's designer sunglasses. The metal card landed with a sharp, distinctive clink that cut through the silence of the backyard. You might want to read the CEO's name on that card, Chloe, I said, keeping my eyes locked on hers. Chloe stared down at the patio table. The midday, Georgia sun caught the gold-embossed lettering on the heavy titanium surface of the business card. She reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. Her manicured fingers traced the cool metal. I watched the exact moment her brain processed the words printed there. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer panic. Read it loud enough for the people in the back. Chloe, I instructed, keeping my voice perfectly calm. Read the name of the CEO. Chloe swallowed hard. Her voice shook as she spoke. Kendra Vance, founder and chief executive officer, Apex Global Holdings. The silence that fell over the backyard was absolute. The aunts and uncles who had just been berating me froze in place. My father, Jerome, took a slow, unsteady step forward. My mother, Vivian, stared at the metal card in Chloe's hand as if it were a venomous snake. Trevor lunged forward, snatched the card from his wife's fingers, He glared at the metal surface, his eyes darting back and forth across the engraved text. His mind could not accept the reality sitting right in front of him. He let out a loud, frantic laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. "This is a joke," he announced, holding the card up. "You had these printed at some cheap coffee shop downtown just to mess with me. This is a pathetic, delusional stunt. You are a dispatcher, Kendra. You drive trucks. You do not own a private equity firm. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I drove trucks 10 years ago, Trevin," I said. "Then I bought the truck. Then I bought the fleet. Then I built a regional dispatch network that swallowed up every minor logistics contract in the tri-state area. While you were blowing venture capital on country club memberships and leased Porsches to look wealthy, I was actually building wealth." I took a step closer to him, watching the arrogant facade begin to crack. "I moved into high-value freight," I continued. "Then maritime shipping logistics. Then asset management. Apex Global is my parent company. I own the infrastructure that moves the products you pretend to invent. That blue-collar embarrassment you and Mother love to mock is the exact reason I have enough liquid capital to buy up the distressed debt of failing tech startups. Startups exactly like yours." Trevin shook his head rapidly, backing away from me. "No," he stammered. "No, the bank would never sell my portfolio to an individual. You are lying. You do not have that kind of leverage." I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my phone. "Let us call the bank manager who brokered your loan sale, Trevon," I said, swiping to unlock the screen. "Let us see just how delusional I am." I tapped the contact name, dialed the number, and put the phone on speaker. I turned the volume all the way up, holding the device out so everyone on the patio could hear. The phone rang once, it rang twice. The backyard was so quiet you could hear the water gently lapping against the sides of the swimming pool. "Good afternoon, Miss Vance." A crisp, professional voice rang out from the speaker. "Have you reviewed the transfer documents for your brother's portfolio?" The confirmation dropped like a bomb in the middle of my parents' pristine lawn. My father grabbed the back of a wrought iron patio chair, his knuckles turning white as he struggled to steady himself. Vivian looked like she had just seen a ghost, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. The murmuring aunts and uncles, who had eagerly condemned me just moments ago, stood entirely mute, their eyes darting nervously toward me. The people who had spent their entire afternoon mocking my clothes and my transportation were now staring at me with a mixture of terror and awe. The hierarchy of the Vance family had just been violently upended. Trevon looked like the ground had just opened up beneath his feet. The sweat beaded on his head, ruining his perfectly tailored appearance. He stared at my phone, his chest heaving as the reality of his situation finally settled in. He was no longer the untouchable golden child. He was entirely at my mercy. I thanked the bank manager, told him I would sign the paperwork shortly, and ended the call. I slipped the phone back into my purse and looked at my brother. Trevin's survival instincts kicked in. The sheer panic in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sudden frantic warmth. He forced a loud, booming laugh, completely changing his tune. In a matter of seconds, he stepped toward me, spreading his arms wide for a hug, as if we were best friends who had just closed a brilliant business deal. "Well, sis," he exclaimed, his voice dripping with fake affection. "Since you own the debt, we can just keep this in-house. This is actually perfect. You can just forgive the loan as a family favor, right? I mean, we are family after all. We have to look out for each other." I took a deliberate step back, refusing to let him touch me. "Forgive it?" I asked, staring at him with cold precision. "Trevon, you committed federal forgery to get that money. You tried to force me into becoming an accessory to your crime. I am not a charity, and I am certainly not your safety net." I reached into my bag one last time and pulled out a thick red folder. "Besides, I did not just buy your debt. I ran a forensic audit on your startup before the acquisition. When you buy a distressed asset, you have to look under the hood. I know exactly where that $2 million went." Chloe's head snapped up. She looked from the red folder to her husband, her blue eyes wide with sudden suspicion. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. I bypassed Trevon and handed the heavy folder directly to Chloe. "I am talking about the offshore shell companies, Chloe," I said smoothly. "I am talking about the Cayman Island accounts paying for your luxury lifestyle while your husband's employees have their paychecks bounce. I suggest you open that folder and see exactly who you married." Chloe looked down at the patio table with a mix of disdain and confusion. The midday Georgia sun beat down on us, reflecting sharply off the heavy matte black titanium surface of the business card I had just tossed in front of her. It did not flutter to the table like flimsy paper. It landed with a solid, resonant clink that commanded immediate attention. She reached out with a trembling manicured hand and picked it up. The sheer weight of the metal seemed to startle her. I watched her pale blue eyes scan the gold-embossed lettering. I watched the exact moment her brain processed the words printed across the dark metal. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered on her face all afternoon completely vanished. All the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking terrified and small. Her perfectly glossed mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a sudden crushing realization that the entire foundation of her privileged life was built on sand. "Read it loud enough for the aunts and uncles in the back." "Chloe," I instructed, keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady. "Read the name of the chief executive officer." Chloe swallowed hard. The crystal wine glass in her other hand trembled so violently I thought she might drop it onto the stone pavers. Her voice shook as the words finally escaped her throat. "Kendra Vance." She read aloud, her tone barely more than a ragged whisper. "Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Apex Global Holdings." The silence that instantly swallowed the backyard was absolute and deafening. The gentle splashing of the swimming pool filter and the distant hum of suburban traffic were the only sounds left in the world. The aunts and uncles, who had just spent the last 20 minutes aggressively condemning my character, froze exactly where they stood. My father, Jerome, took a slow, unsteady step forward, his brow furrowed in deep, uncomprehending confusion. My mother. Vivian stared at the metal card in Chloe's hand as if it were a live grenade waiting to detonate and destroy her perfect country club reputation. Trevin broke the silence by lunging forward. He snatched the heavy titanium card right out of his wife's shaking fingers. He glared at the metal surface, his eyes darting frantically back and forth across the engraved text. His mind fundamentally could not accept the reality sitting right in the palm of his hand. To accept that I was the chief executive of a multinational private equity and logistics firm meant accepting that he was a complete failure. The golden child of the Vance family was experiencing a total narcissistic collapse in real time. He tried to bend the metal card in his fist, but the titanium would not yield. He let out a loud, frantic laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. It was a harsh barking sound meant to reclaim his dominance over the patio, but it only made him look desperate. "This is an absolute joke," Trevon announced, holding the card up in the air for the silent family to see. "You actually went to some cheap novelty print shop in downtown Atlanta and paid $50 to have fake metal cards made just to mess with me. This is a pathetic and delusional stunt, Kendra. You are a freight dispatcher. You drive delivery trucks for a living. You do not own a private equity firm." I did not raise my voice to match his yelling. I did not need to. True power never has to shout. "I drove delivery trucks 10 years ago, Trevon," I said, keeping my posture completely relaxed. "Then I bought the truck. Then I bought the fleet. Then I built a regional dispatch network that swallowed up every minor shipping contract in the entire tri-state area. While you were blowing venture capital on luxury golf memberships and leasing Porsches to look wealthy on social media, I was actually building generational wealth in the dark." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him, watching the arrogant facade crumble piece by piece. I moved into high-value freight logistics. I continued my voice carrying clearly across the lawn. Then maritime shipping, then global asset management. Apex Global is my parent company. I own the physical infrastructure that moves the products you pretend to invent. That blue-collar embarrassment you and Mother love to mock so endlessly is the exact reason I have enough liquid capital to buy up the distressed debt of failing tech startups. Startups exactly like yours. Trevon shook his head rapidly, backing away from me, as if my words were physically striking him. "No," he stammered his chest, heaving under his expensive linen suit. "No, the bank would never sell my financial portfolio to an individual. You are lying. You do not have that kind of leverage or clearance. You are just a bitter woman trying to ruin my celebration." He turned to the crowd of relatives, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "Do not listen to her," he yelled desperately, trying to maintain his grip on his audience. "She does not even have enough money in her checking account to cover the catering for this barbecue, let alone own an equity firm. She is just trying to scare us because she knows she is a failure." I let the silence stretch out after his frantic rant. I let him dig his own grave a little deeper. I looked at the man who had tormented me since childhood, who had belittled my hard work, who had just tried to force me into committing federal wire fraud to save his own skin. I felt no anger toward him anymore. I only felt a cold, clinical precision. I was the predator who had successfully cornered her prey, and there was no escape left for him. I slowly reached my hand into my leather tote bag. I bypassed my wallet and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated brightly against the afternoon shadows, casting a cool glow on my face. I looked directly into my brother's panicked eyes. "We do not have to rely on novelty business cards to prove anything, Trevin," I said smoothly. "As a matter of fact, I have the direct cell phone number for the Senior Vice President of Commercial Lending at your bank, the exact same executive manager who brokered the sale of your massive distressed debt portfolio to my firm just a few hours ago." I swiped my screen and located the contact. Trevon's breathing became shallow and erratic. Chloe grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. My mother took a step forward, opening her mouth to stop me, but no words came out. The entire family watched in paralyzed fascination as I tapped the green call button and immediately switched the phone to speaker. I held the device out in front of me so the sound would project with crystal clarity across the quiet patio. The electronic dial tone echoed loudly in the humid air, ringing once, then twice. "Let us call the bank manager who brokered your loan sale." "Trevon," I said, a sharp, triumphant smile finally breaking across my face. "Let us see exactly how delusional I really am." The first electronic ring echoed across the patio. It sounded unnaturally loud against the backdrop of absolute silence. Trevon stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the screen of my phone as if it were a live grenade. I did not break eye contact with him. I wanted him to feel every single second of this moment. I wanted him to understand exactly how he had engineered his own total destruction. The phone rang for a second time, a long, agonizing tone that made Chloe physically flinch. I shifted my gaze to my mother. Vivian was staring at me, her breathing shallow, her perfectly styled hair catching the afternoon sun. I addressed her directly, my voice carrying the weight of a decade of rejection and unearned shame. "You called my job a blue-collar embarrassment, Mother," I said, keeping my tone even and measured. "You told all your friends at the country club that I was a failure because I dropped out of your precious pre-law program. You said driving a delivery truck was beneath our family legacy. You banned me from Thanksgiving dinner that first year because I smelled like diesel fuel and warehouse dust. You told me I was throwing my life away, and you demanded that I never speak of my work to your elite social circle." I let the third ring sound before continuing. "What you never bothered to ask was what I was actually doing with those trucks. I did not just drive them. I learned them. I learned the routes, the margins, the maintenance schedules, and the massive glaring inefficiencies in the regional supply chain. While you were busy funding Trevon's luxury lifestyle and paying for his expensive networking seminars, I was sleeping in the cab of a used box truck I bought at a government auction. I took the overnight freight jobs nobody else wanted. I ran routes through ice storms and holiday weekends. I built a reputation for absolute reliability, while my brother was building a reputation for throwing the best corporate parties in Atlanta. I turned my attention back to Trevon. He was sweating profusely now. The confident tech founder facade had completely melted away, leaving only a terrified man who realized he was entirely out of his depth. The fourth ring chimed, ringing out like a countdown. "You thought you were so much better than me, Trevon," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "You thought your venture capital pitches and your sleek downtown office made you a visionary. But you never actually produced anything real. You just burned through other people's money to look successful. I built something tangible. I bought one truck, then I bought 5, then I bought 50. I secured exclusive regional contracts because I actually did the grueling, exhausting work that you believed was beneath you." I looked at Chloe, who was gripping the edge of the patio table, her knuckles stark white against her tanned skin. Her designer world was collapsing. "I bought the warehouses, Chloe." I continued, ensuring she understood the sheer scale of my operation. "I bought the distribution centers. I built a regional dispatch network that eventually swallowed every minor logistics contract in the Southeast. And when I conquered the regional market, I moved into national freight, then maritime shipping, then global asset management. That is how Apex Global was born." I declared, my voice ringing with undeniable authority. "Not from a trust fund, not from fraudulent bank loans. From the exact same blue-collar labor you both stood here and mocked just 10 minutes ago. The fifth ring echoed, stretching the tension to its absolute breaking point. The aunts and uncles, who had eagerly condemned me, were now staring at the ground, unable to meet my gaze. My father, Jerome, finally found his voice. He took a hesitant step forward, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. Kendra, he started, his tone completely different now, carrying a desperate pleading quality that sickened me. Kendra, please hang up the phone. We can discuss this. We did not know. We had no idea what you were building. I held up my free hand, silencing him instantly. You did not know because you never cared to look. Dad, I replied, my voice sharp and unyielding. You were too busy protecting your golden child to notice that your daughter was building an empire in the shadows. You let him commit federal wire fraud today, and you stood by silently while my mother tried to force me to take the fall for his crimes. You do not get to ask for mercy now just because you realized I am the one holding all the leverage. I focused entirely on Trayvon again, refusing to let him look away. I own the physical infrastructure that moves the global economy. Trayvon, the people you call the help, are the people who run my company. They are the backbone of my success. And that exact success is what gave me the liquid capital required to buy up the distressed debt of failing tech startups. I let that reality sink in, watching his chest heave as he struggled to breathe. Startups that have flashy names but zero actual revenue. I continued relentlessly. Startups built on lies and forged signatures. Startups exactly like yours. You mocked my clothes and my ride here today because you thought you were the predator. But you are just a bad investment, and I am the collection agency. Trevin opened his mouth to beg, his hands trembling at his sides. He took a desperate step forward, but the electronic ringing abruptly stopped. The connection clicked open. The heavy, suffocating silence of the backyard was shattered by the crisp, professional voice coming through the speaker of my smartphone. Good afternoon, Miss Vance, the bank manager, said, his voice projecting clearly across the patio, commanding the attention of every single person present. Have you reviewed the transfer documents for your brother's portfolio? I kept the phone elevated, ensuring the speaker was directed toward the crowd. Yes, Mr. Sterling, I have the documents right in front of me, I said, my voice completely steady. However, I have my brother Trayvon and my entire family here with me right now. For the sake of absolute clarity, could you please confirm the current status of the $2 million commercial bridge loan associated with his startup? The patio was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the abandoned cocktail glasses. Certainly, Miss Vance, the bank manager, replied, his crisp corporate tone cutting through the thick Georgia humidity. As of 9 this morning, our institution has fully finalized the sale of that distressed debt. The entire $2 million portfolio, including all associated liabilities and penalties, has been acquired by your firm. Apex Global Holdings is now the sole primary creditor for your brother's company. I let those words hang in the air for a few seconds. I watched the reality of the situation crash over my family like a tidal wave. But I was not finished. And just to be perfectly clear, Mr. Sterling, I continued, holding my father Jerome's gaze. If the debtor fails to meet the repayment terms, or if there are any irregularities found in the original loan application, such as a forged signature on the collateral agreement, who has the authority to call the loan in and demand immediate payment in full? You do, Miss Vance, the bank manager, stated without a single second of hesitation. As the majority debt holder, Apex Global has full discretionary authority to call the loan in at any time. You hold all the leverage. If he defaults, you have the legal right to seize the business assets and begin liquidation. Shall I proceed with the final transfer protocols? Yes, please initiate the final protocols, I said. I will call you back shortly to confirm my final decision on the asset liquidation. Thank you for your time. I tapped the red button to end the call. The electronic beep signaled the end of the conversation, but it also signaled the complete and utter destruction of my family's social hierarchy. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the sound of a 8-year-old golden child falling from his pedestal and shattering into a million pieces on the concrete patio. My father Jerome was the first to physically break. The man who had spent his entire life projecting an image of flawless black excellence and patriarchal control suddenly looked incredibly old and fragile. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly grayish hue. He reached a trembling hand up to his chest, clutching the fabric of his expensive polo shirt, as if his heart was giving out. His knees buckled beneath him. He stumbled backward and slumped heavily into a wrought iron patio chair. The metal chair groaned under his dead weight. He just sat there staring blindly at the swimming pool, completely unable to process that his perfect son was a fraud and his discarded daughter was a billionaire. My mother, Vivian, was entirely speechless. This was a woman who had never been at a loss for words in her entire life. She always had a sharp criticism, a condescending remark, or a cruel observation, ready to deploy. But now she stood frozen on the lawn, her mouth slightly open. She stared at me as if I were a ghost. Her eyes darted from my face to the heavy titanium business card still resting on the table and back to my face. The blue-collar embarrassment she had just banned from her property was the only person standing between her family and total financial ruin. The cognitive dissonance was short-circuiting her brain. She had built her entire identity on being superior to me, and now she was nothing more than a spectator to my power. The extended family, the aunts and uncles, who had eagerly formed a circle to intimidate me just minutes ago, were now shrinking away. Aunt Patrice, who had proudly accused me of being a bitter and jealous woman, lowered her head and stared intently at her designer sandals. Uncle Darnell, who had turned off the music to watch my humiliation, took a slow, awkward step backward, trying to blend into the landscaping. The collective arrogance of my relatives had vanished. They were terrified. They realized they had just aggressively insulted a woman who possessed enough liquid capital to buy and sell their entire lives without breaking a sweat. The power dynamic in the backyard had shifted so violently and so irreversibly that the air actually felt different to breathe. I turned my attention back to the center of the patio. Chloe was leaning heavily against the outdoor bar, looking like she might physically vomit. The realization that she was married to a broke criminal rather than a wealthy tech visionary was destroying her. And then there was Trevon. My older brother was sweating profusely. Large drops of perspiration rolled down his forehead and soaked into the collar of his expensive linen suit. The muscles in his jaw twitched erratically as he looked around the silent yard, searching for someone, anyone to save him. But his father was slumped in a chair. His mother was paralyzed with shock. His wife was looking at him with pure disgust. He was completely out of options. So, he did the only thing a true narcissist knows how to do when they are backed into a corner. He pivoted. The sheer panic in Trevon's eyes suddenly vanished, replaced by a frantic, desperate warmth. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and forced a loud, booming laugh. It was a terrifyingly hollow sound that echoed weirdly against the silence of the backyard. He pasted a giant, charming smile onto his face, completely ignoring the fact that I had just exposed him as a fraud. He took a step towards me and threw his arms wide open as if we were best friends, celebrating a massive victory. "Well, sis," Trevon shouted, his voice dripping with an artificial, sugary sweetness that made my skin crawl. "This is actually incredible news. I mean, since you own the debt now, we can just keep this all in-house. This is perfect. We do not have to worry about the bank anymore. You can just forgive the loan as a family favor, right? I mean, we are family. We have to look out for each other." Trevon approached me with his arms spread wide open. The terrified man from seconds ago had suddenly vanished, replaced by the charming older brother who always got exactly what he wanted. His smile was painfully artificial, stretching across his face as he tried to wrap me in a familial embrace. He actually thought a quick hug and a fake laugh could erase a felony. He genuinely believed that after a lifetime of treating me like a disposable stepping stone, he could simply cash in on the concept of family loyalty to save his own skin. I took a sharp, deliberate step backward. I refused to let him touch me. The heavy scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sour smell of his nervous sweat hung in the air between us. "Forgive it?" I asked, staring at him with cold precision. "Trevon, you committed federal forgery to get that money. You tried to force me into becoming an accessory to your crime while our parents stood by and watched. I am not a charity, and I am certainly not your safety net." His fake smile shattered. The brief glimmer of hope in his eyes died instantly. He lowered his arms, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin another web of lies to somehow charm his way out of the corner he had painted himself into. But I did not give him the chance to regain control of the narrative. The days of Trevon controlling the room were permanently over. I reached into my leather tote bag for the final time. My hand brushed past my wallet and wrapped around a thick, heavy red folder. I pulled it out and held it up. The bright crimson color stood out starkly against the lush green backdrop of my parents' perfectly manicured lawn. The family watched the folder with a mixture of dread and morbid fascination. They knew whatever was inside those pages was going to destroy the last remaining fragments of their golden child's reputation. Besides, I did not just buy your debt blindly, Trevon, I said, my voice projecting clearly, so every single aunt and uncle on the patio could hear exactly what kind of man they had been worshipping. When my firm acquires a distressed asset, we do not just sign the paperwork and hope for the best. We look under the hood. I ran a complete and total forensic audit on your startup before the acquisition was finalized. I know exactly where that $2 million went. Trevon's face went completely ashen. All the blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking physically sick. The confident tech founder was gone, replaced by a panicked thief who had just been caught red-handed. I turned to address my father, Jerome, who was still slumped in his patio chair holding his chest. Dad, you bragged to all your friends at the golf course about your visionary son. I said you told everyone he was developing groundbreaking logistics software that was going to change the world. But the audit revealed the truth. Trevon's company does not have a single viable product. There is no software. There are no developers. There is no engineering team. It is nothing but a shell company. It is a flashy website and an expensive leased office downtown used exclusively to burn through venture capital and fraudulent bank loans. Trevon shook his head rapidly. That is a lie, he stammered, his voice cracking. We are in the development phase. We have massive overhead costs. Research and development takes massive amounts of capital. Kendra, you do not understand the tech industry. You just move boxes around. I understand basic corporate accounting. Trevon and I shot back, slicing through his pathetic excuses with absolute authority. And more importantly, I understand money laundering. That was when Chloe finally stepped forward. She had been leaning heavily against the outdoor bar, watching her husband fall apart piece by piece. The perfectly polished, entitled white woman who had aggressively insulted my clothes and my transportation just 20 minutes ago now looked like a terrified child. The reality of her situation was crashing down around her. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to set her designer wine glass down on the granite countertop before she dropped it. What are you talking about? Chloe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her pale blue eyes darted frantically from the red folder in my hand to her husband's sweating face. Trevon, what is she talking about? Where did the money go? Trevon tried to reach for her, his face twisted in desperation. Chloe, baby, do not listen to her. She is just trying to tear us apart. She is trying to ruin our lives. Chloe pulled away from him, refusing his touch just as I had refused his hug moments earlier. The doubt in her eyes was metastasizing into pure panic. I bypassed my brother entirely and walked directly over to his wife. I stopped in front of her, holding out the heavy red folder. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking the folder from my hands. She opened the cover, her eyes scanning the top pages of the financial ledger. The spreadsheets were highlighted, tracking the exact flow of funds from the fraudulent bank loan directly into private accounts. I am talking about the offshore shell companies, Chloe, I said smoothly, ensuring my words carried the absolute weight of undeniable proof. I am talking about the Cayman Island accounts, the ones paying for your exclusive country club membership and the lease on your brand new Porsche. I suggest you look closely at that ledger and see exactly who you married. Chloe stared down at the top page of the ledger. Her eyes darted across the columns of numbers and highlighted bank transfers. The manicured nails she was so proud of were trembling so hard they tapped against the thick paper. She flipped to the second page, and then the third. The color that had rushed to her face earlier was entirely gone. She looked like a woman standing on the edge of a cliff who had just realized the bridge behind her was on fire. Trevon, what is this? Chloe asked, her voice cracking. What are these transfers? I did not give my brother the chance to formulate another lie. I stepped forward, addressing the entire patio. I wanted every aunt, uncle, and cousin who had spent the last hour judging my worth to hear exactly what they had been defending. Your golden child does not have a tech company, I announced, projecting my voice across the silent lawn. He has a shell company. For the last 2 years, he has been standing at family dinners, bragging about disruptive technology and innovative algorithms. But the forensic audit my team conducted revealed the absolute truth. There is no software. There is no product. There is not a single line of proprietary code that actually functions. Trevon opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer weight of the evidence sitting in his wife's hands silenced him. When the initial seed money ran out 6 months ago, Trevon panicked. I continued relentlessly. He knew he could not maintain the illusion of black excellence without cash. So, he forged my signature to secure that $2 million commercial loan. But he did not use that money to pay developers or rent server space. He routed it directly through a subsidiary holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. Aunt Patrice, who had been so vocal earlier, tried to step in. Now, Kendra, she started, her voice shaking. Surely there is a reasonable explanation for corporate accounts. Businesses move money all the time. I turned my gaze to her, shutting down her willful ignorance immediately. They do not move it into personal luxury accounts. Aunt Patrice. I turned my attention back to Chloe, who was still staring at the ledger in horror. Look at page 4, Chloe, I instructed. Look at the itemized disbursements. That is how your $50,000 initiation fee for the Buckhead Country Club was paid. That is how the down payment on your white Porsche Panamera cleared the dealership. You have been walking around this family acting like royalty, but your entire lifestyle is funded by stolen money. You are wearing jewelry bought with fraudulent bank loans. My mother. Vivian let out a sharp gasp. She reached out and grabbed my father Jerome's arm, her fingers digging into his polo shirt. I watched their faces closely. I expected to see outrage or maybe a profound sense of moral failure. But that is not how my parents operate. They were not horrified that their son was a criminal. They were horrified that he was a sloppy one. Oh, my lord. The country club. Vivian whispered, her voice trembling with absolute dread. Jerome, the church board, the neighbors. If this goes public, we are ruined. We will be laughingstocks. They were not thinking about the fraud. They were not thinking about the fact that their son had tried to frame their daughter. They were solely thinking about the social fallout. The idea of their elite friends discovering that their son was a con artist was a fate worse than death to them. Jerome wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, looking physically ill. His legacy, the pristine family image he had sacrificed my mental health to protect, was collapsing right in front of him. And it gets worse, I said, refusing to let them look away from the wreckage while you two were drinking vintage champagne and posting luxury vacation photos on social media. The actual employees working at your downtown office were starving. The audit showed that payroll bounced 3 weeks ago. You stopped paying the administrative staff, the logistics clerks, and the junior developers. I know this for a fact because my firm had to field angry calls from your unpaid vendors during the acquisition process. You stole from working-class people to buy designer clothes and fund your arrogant charade. Trevon finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He lunged toward Chloe, reaching for the red folder. Chloe, give me that, he demanded, his voice frantic and high-pitched. She is twisting the numbers. It is just corporate restructuring. Every startup goes through a lean phase. Chloe did not hand over the folder. Instead, she took a sharp step backward, her heels scraping loudly against the stone pavers. She looked at the man she had married, and the disgust on her face was absolute. The picture-perfect marriage they paraded in front of the world was dissolving right there on the patio. Do not touch me, Chloe screamed, swatting his hand away violently. The sudden outburst made several family members jump. Chloe held the ledger up, shaking it in Trevon's face. You told me we were fully funded, she yelled, her voice echoing across the swimming pool. You looked me in the eye and told me the money was from legitimate venture capital. You promised me you had secured series of funding. You lied to me, Trevon. Baby, please, Trevon pleaded, holding his hands up in a desperate, placating gesture. I was going to fix it. I just needed a little more time to close a major deal. I was protecting you from the stress. Protecting me? Chloe laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that bordered on hysterical. You made me an accessory. My name is on the joint accounts. Trevon. If this goes down, I go down with you. I am not going to federal prison because you wanted to play tech billionaire. She threw the heavy red folder directly at his chest. The thick stack of papers spilled out, fluttering to the grass around his expensive leather shoes. The irony was poetic. Just 30 minutes ago, Trevon had thrown legal documents onto my plate of food. Now his own fraudulent financial records were scattered at his feet, thrown by the woman he had stolen to impress. Chloe turned away from him, her chest heaving. I am calling my father, she announced, her voice shaking with rage. I am calling my lawyers. We are done, Trevon. I am not letting you drag my family name through the mud. Chloe paced the edge of the swimming pool, her designer heels clicking frantically against the stone pavers. She was holding her smartphone tight against her chest, breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. She was already crafting her defense strategy out loud, making sure everyone on the patio heard her newly revised narrative. She was desperately trying to rewrite history in real time. "I had no idea," Chloe cried out, her voice trembling with forced innocence. "I do not know the first thing about commercial lending or venture capital. Trevon handled all of our finances. He told me the business was booming. He told me the investors were thrilled with his progress. I am just a wife who trusted her husband. I am a victim in all of this." I watched her perform this calculated routine. It was the exact same weaponized fragility she had used to insult my dress and my working-class background just an hour ago. She genuinely thought she could simply detach herself from the sinking ship and float away on a raft of manufactured innocence. She expected the family to rally behind her tears. But the aunts and uncles who had coddled her earlier were now staring at her with profound disgust. The racial dynamics she had so eagerly manipulated to elevate herself above me were completely useless now that her own hands were dirty. I took a deliberate step forward, blocking her path. "Put the phone down, Chloe," I said, my voice slicing through her theatrical sobbing. "Do not insult my intelligence by playing the naive victim. You are not an innocent bystander who accidentally stumbled into a life of stolen luxury. You are an active and willing participant in massive financial fraud." Chloe froze, her pale blue eyes darting toward me. "I did not do anything," she stammered, taking a step backward. "I just signed where he told me to sign." I gestured to the papers Trevon was still frantically trying to gather from the grass. "Did you think I only audited the corporate operating accounts?" I asked, stepping closer so she could not look away. "I audited the personal holdings, too. I saw the incorporation documents for the shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. A shell company that clearly lists you as the primary managing director. You do not accidentally sign offshore banking authorizations, Chloe. You do not unknowingly wire hundreds of thousands of dollars into private holding accounts to avoid federal tax scrutiny." Chloe opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came out. The blood had completely drained from her face. "You knew exactly what you were doing." I continued relentlessly, refusing to give her an inch of breathing room. "You sat in those fake board meetings. You signed the disbursement forms that drained the payroll accounts so you could buy designer bags and fund your ridiculous country club lifestyle. You stole from hardworking people to pretend you were elite. So do not stand here on my parents' patio and cry victim. When the federal investigators look at those signatures, they are not going to see a naive wife. They are going to see a highly coordinated embezzlement ring." Chloe stopped pacing entirely. Her performative tears instantly dried up, replaced by a stark, terrifying realization that she was legally bound to this disaster. There was no escape hatch. She looked down at Trevon, who was still on his knees, clutching the scattered financial records. He glared up at her with a sick, twisted sort of satisfaction. If he was going down, he was absolutely taking her with him to the bottom. Their picture-perfect marriage was completely dissolving right in front of the entire extended family. The absolute destruction of her golden child was finally too much for my mother to bear. The reality of federal investigations, offshore accounts, and imminent public scandal broke right through Vivian's wall of arrogance. The proud, elitist matriarch, who had spent her entire life meticulously curating a flawless social image, was completely shattered. The facade was gone. Vivian walked toward me, her posture entirely deflated. She looked small and frail, suddenly aged by the sheer weight of the catastrophe her son had created. Her hands were shaking visibly as she closed the distance between us. She bypassed Trevon completely, focusing all her desperate energy on me. She reached out and grabbed my forearm. Her grip was weak and trembling. "Kendra, please," Vivian begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "Please, you have to stop this. You have made your point. We understand now. We see how successful you are. You do not have to do this." I looked down at the woman who had just barred me from her home, the woman who had told me I was dead to her, the woman who had ordered me to leave her property through the back alley, like the help because I was an embarrassment to her legacy. She tried to pull me closer, attempting to use a maternal warmth that she had withheld from me for 35 years. "We can fix this, Kendra," she pleaded, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, ruining her expensive cosmetics. "We can keep this quiet." We can handle this privately without involving the authorities or the banks. Trevin made a terrible mistake, but he is still your brother. We are family. Do not destroy your brother. I felt absolutely nothing for her tears. The emotional manipulation that used to control my every move, that used to make me seek her approval at my own expense, was completely powerless against me now. I looked past her to where my father Jerome was still slumped in his chair, silently watching his wife beg the daughter he had abandoned. Neither of them possessed the integrity to hold Tran accountable. They only cared about hiding his crimes. I firmly removed my mother's hand from my arm. I stepped back, severing the physical and emotional connection permanently. He destroyed himself, I replied coldly, my voice echoing across the silent yard. I am just the collection agency, and I am calling the loan in full by 9 on Monday morning. The words hung in the oppressive summer air. 9 on Monday morning. The deadline was a physical weight dropping squarely onto Trevon's shoulders. I watched the last remaining shreds of his arrogant pride evaporate. He looked at me, and for the very first time in his entire life, he did not see a vulnerable younger sister he could bully. He saw an executioner. Trevin raised his hands, his fingers trembling uncontrollably. "Kendra, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine that I had never heard from him before. "You know I do not have $2 million in liquid capital. The accounts are tied up. The offshore transfers cannot be reversed that quickly. If you call the loan in on Monday, the bank will freeze everything. The authorities will be notified. I will lose my company." "You do not have a company, Trevin," I reminded him, my tone devoid of any sympathy. "You have a glorified Ponzi scheme. And you are right. The authorities will be notified. Federal wire fraud and corporate embezzlement carry mandatory minimum sentences. You are not just looking at bankruptcy. You are looking at a decade in a federal penitentiary." The reality of the word penitentiary seemed to snap the final string holding him together. My older brother, the untouchable golden child of the Vance family, collapsed. He physically gave out, dropping heavily to his knees right there on the stone patio. The expensive tailored fabric of his linen suit scraped against the hard concrete, but he did not care. He clasped his hands together in front of his chest, looking up at me from the ground. It was a pathetic and jarring sight. "I am begging you, Kendra." He pleaded, tears welling up in his eyes and spilling over his cheeks. "I will do anything. I will pay you back every single cent. I will get a job. I will liquidate the cars. Just please do not send me to prison. Do not take my life away." I stared down at him. I thought about the decade I spent building my logistics empire in the dark, while he paraded around in the light, mocking my very existence. I thought about how quickly he had thrown legal documents onto my plate of food just hours earlier, demanding I sign away my future to cover his mistakes. He was not crying because he regretted stealing. He was crying because he had finally been caught. "I do not want your cars, Trevin," I said, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "And I do not want to see you go to federal prison either. Despite everything you have done to me, I still value the family name enough to keep it out of a criminal indictment." My mother let out a loud, ragged gasp of relief from a few feet away, believing that I was finally backing down. But I was not backing down. I was closing the trap. I reached into my leather tote bag one final time. I bypassed the red audit folder and pulled out a crisp, clean manila envelope. I opened the clasp and extracted a single legal document printed on thick, high-quality paper. I stepped forward and held the document out so Trevon could see the bold black text at the top of the page. It was an irrevocable transfer of deed and equity. "I knew you did not have the liquid capital to cover your fraudulent loan." I explained, my voice echoing with absolute authority across the silent backyard. "I anticipated your insolvency the moment my firm acquired your debt. So, I had my legal team draft a solution. An alternative repayment plan that keeps you out of handcuffs and keeps the Securities and Exchange Commission away from your offshore accounts." Trevon stared at the document, his chest heaving. "What is it?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. "What do I have to do?" "You are going to sign over your 80% equity share of grandmother's commercial lot to me," I stated cleanly and clearly, free and clear. "You will permanently surrender all rights, all claims, and all future profits associated with that property. You will give me complete and total ownership of her legacy." Trevon flinched as if I had physically struck him. "But that property is worth millions," he protested weakly. "It is the only real asset I have left." It is my safety net. It is the asset you tried to steal from me today, I reminded him sharply, and it is the only leverage you possess that I actually want. Here are the terms, Trayvon. You sign the property over to me right now. In exchange, I will restructure your $2 million corporate debt into a 10-year personal repayment plan. I will bury the forensic audit files deep in my company vault. I will not hand the embezzlement records over to the federal authorities. You get to keep your freedom, and you get 10 years to pay back the money you stole. I took a step closer, looking down into his tear-stained face. But you lose the property. You lose the golden ticket you thought you could cash in. You walk away from grandmother's legacy with absolutely nothing. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with horror. You are taking everything, he whispered. I am giving you your life, Trevin. I corrected him, my voice dropping to a cold, calculating register. I am offering you a way out of a concrete jail cell. I suggest you take it before I change my mind and make that phone call to the authorities. Trevon looked desperately toward our parents. He turned his head, searching for his father to step in and save him, just like Jerome had always done. But my father was still slumped in his patio chair, staring at the ground. Jerome had no money to buy Trevin's way out of a $2 million hole. He had no power to override a corporate debt acquisition. He was completely bankrupt of solutions. Trevon looked at our mother. Vivian had her hands pressed over her mouth, weeping silently. She could not protect him from the consequences of his own fraud. The social shield she had meticulously built over 3 decades was entirely useless against cold, hard financial leverage. Finally, Trevon looked at his wife. Chloe was standing near the edge of the pool, gripping her phone. She would not even meet his eyes. She was already mentally calculating how quickly her divorce attorneys could freeze their remaining joint accounts. Trevon was entirely alone. He was completely cornered with no allies, no money, and no escape routes left to exploit. He slowly turned his gaze back to me. The realization that he had been utterly defeated by the sister he considered a blue-collar failure washed over his face, settling deep into his features. The golden child was dead. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a sleek silver pen. I held it out toward him, pointing the tip down at the legal document I had placed on the patio table next to him. Sign the paper, Trevin, I commanded. He swallowed hard. He slowly raised his arm. His hand was shaking so violently he could barely extend his fingers. He reached out and took the pen from my grasp. The sleek silver metal of the pen looked entirely out of place in his trembling hand. He stared down at the crisp white paper resting on the glass patio table. This was the exact same table where he had casually tossed his fraudulent bank papers onto my plate of barbecue just a few hours ago. Now it was the altar where he was sacrificing his entire future. The irony hung heavy in the stifling Georgia heat. He read over the stark black text, detailing the irrevocable transfer of deed and equity. The ink would legally bind him to a 10-year repayment plan and permanently strip away the only valuable asset he possessed. He looked toward our father one last time, begging for an intervention that was never going to come. Jerome had completely folded. He was sitting with his face buried in his hands, unable to watch his golden child surrender the family's crown jewel. Vivian was openly sobbing into a lace tissue, her perfect matriarchal image destroyed. Trevin pressed the tip of the pen to the paper. The scratching sound of the ink flowing across the page was agonizingly slow. It was the loudest noise in the entire backyard. He signed his full legal name on the primary line. He initialed the tight margins. He dated the bottom of the page. With every single stroke, he officially surrendered our grandmother's commercial property to me. He signed away his safety net, his financial leverage, and his unearned legacy. When he finished the final letter, he stared at his own signature as if it were a death warrant. The transfer was complete. I was now the sole owner of the most valuable piece of real estate in our family's history. I had protected what my grandmother built from the son who would have squandered it. The reality of his absolute defeat suddenly seemed to snap whatever fragile restraint Trevon had left. The terrified, cornered thief vanished, and the arrogant, resentful older brother returned with a violent, unpredictable vengeance. He stood up abruptly from the patio chair, his chest heaving under his sweat-soaked linen suit. His eyes were completely bloodshot, burning with a toxic mixture of profound humiliation and pure, unfiltered hatred. He gripped the silver pen so tightly in his fist, his knuckles turned white. Without any warning, he cocked his arm back and threw the pen directly at my chest. The heavy metal barrel struck my collarbone hard enough to leave a sharp, stinging ache before clattering uselessly onto the stone pavers at my feet. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not raise my hands to protect myself. I simply looked down at the pen rolling across the patio and then slowly lifted my gaze back up to meet his. Trevin needed to reclaim some fraction of his shattered pride. He needed to make me feel small again because tearing me down was the only dynamic he actually understood. You think you are so incredibly powerful, do you not? Trevon spat, his voice trembling with sheer venom. You think buying my corporate debt and stealing grandmother's land makes you a winner? You are nothing, Kendra. You are a miserable, lonely fraud. I took a step toward me, pointing an accusatory finger. You can flash all the matte black titanium business cards you want, but at the end of the day, you have absolutely no one. You have no husband to go home to. You have no children to pass this so-called empire down to. You have a giant empty bank account and a life completely devoid of any actual joy. You are just a bitter, obsessive workaholic who spent a decade hiding in the shadows because you knew you could never measure up to the standard I set. I am a builder, Kendra. You are just a parasite feeding off my temporary misfortune. I stood perfectly still, letting his desperate, pathetic insults wash over me. His words were deliberately designed to cut deep, to target the personal vulnerabilities my family had constantly exploited since I was a teenager. They always equated a woman's worth with her marital status and her ability to produce heirs. But his insults carried absolutely no weight. They were the frantic, flailing motions of a drowning man trying to pull someone else under the water with him. Before I could formulate a calm response, Chloe decided to join the attack. Her picture-perfect marriage was in absolute ruins, and she was facing potential federal investigations for offshore embezzlement. But her deeply ingrained entitlement simply refused to die quietly. She stepped forward, wiping the smeared designer mascara from under her pale blue eyes. She let out a sharp, hysterical laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Hi is absolutely right." Chloe sneered, her voice thick with unearned condescension. "You can buy all the offshore corporate debt in the world, but you cannot buy class. You are standing here claiming to be a billionaire, but you had to take a cheap rideshare to your own family barbecue." She gestured wildly at my outfit, looking me up and down with profound disgust. "You showed up in a basic department store dress because you do not even know how to look the part of a successful woman. You do not own any real jewelry. You do not even own a luxury vehicle. You are standing on my in-laws' patio acting like you rule the entire global economy, but you cannot even afford a damn car. You will always be exactly what you started out as, Kendra. You will always be nothing more than blue-collar trash." The silence that followed Chloe's outburst was thick and expectant. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the old Kendra to emerge, the one who would internalize their cruelty and quietly leave feeling thoroughly defeated. They wanted me to be ashamed of the very things that kept me grounded. The modest dress, the lack of flashy jewelry, the practical transportation were all deliberate choices, not limitations. But explaining the concept of stealth wealth to people drowning in superficial debt was a complete waste of breath. I looked at the two of them standing shoulder to shoulder in their ruined designer clothes, desperately clinging to the illusion of superiority because it was literally the only thing they had left in the world. I stood perfectly still, letting the echo of Chloe's vicious insults fade into the heavy Georgia heat. The entire extended family watched me with bated breath. They were waiting for the inevitable explosion. They expected the old Kendra to resurface. They wanted me to scream or cry or aggressively defend my worth just like I used to do when we were younger. They desperately needed me to react with raw emotion, because an emotional reaction would mean they still had some measure of control over my feelings. But I felt absolutely no anger toward them. Anger requires emotional investment, and I was completely bankrupt of any emotional attachment to these people. I looked down at the heavy silver pen resting on the stone pavers where it had bounced off my chest. I did not bend down to pick it up. I simply stepped over it. I reached out and picked up the crisp legal document resting on the glass patio table. The ink of Trevin's signature was perfectly dry. I folded the irrevocable transfer of deed and slid it carefully into my leather tote bag. I pulled the brass zipper closed. That sharp metallic sound finalized the transaction. The commercial lot was legally mine. My grandmother's legacy was officially protected from the sheer incompetence of her golden grandson. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder and looked back at my brother and his wife. Trevin was breathing heavily, his face flushed with a toxic mix of humiliation and lingering arrogance. Chloe was standing right beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, holding on to the delusion that her designer clothes somehow made her superior to me. She had just called me blue-collar trash. She had mocked my transportation in my modest dress. I slowly raised my left arm and pulled back the sleeve of my olive green dress. I looked down at my wrist. The heavy platinum face of my Rolex Daytona caught the bright afternoon sunlight. It was a custom timepiece acquired during a logistics summit in Geneva. It cost more than the down payment on the house they were currently standing behind, but it lacked the flashy diamonds that people like Chloe relied upon to signal their net worth. I checked the time, noting the precise position of the hands. Everything was running exactly on schedule. I lowered my arm and met Chloe's pale blue eyes. "You have a very fundamental misunderstanding of how real power operates in this world. Chloe," I said, my voice entirely calm and conversational. "You and Trevin operate on the illusion of wealth. You lease expensive luxury vehicles and wear flashy designer labels because you are desperately trying to convince everyone around you that you belong in rooms you cannot actually afford to enter. You use money as a costume. You use it to intimidate people because you are fundamentally hollow inside." I took a slow step toward her, watching her defensive posture falter slightly under my steady gaze. "When you actually own the infrastructure that moves the global economy, you do not need to play dress-up," I continued. "I do not need to lease a Porsche to impress women at a suburban country club. I wear a comfortable dress from 3 seasons ago because my daily decisions impact international trade margins, not neighborhood gossip. My worth is measured in corporate acquisitions and global supply chain efficiency, not the logo printed on your handbag." I turned my attention to Trayvon, who was glaring at me with unabashed hatred. "And as for my transportation today, Trayvon," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level, "I did not take a commercial rideshare to this family barbecue because I lack the financial liquidity to purchase a vehicle. I own an entire fleet of vehicles." Trevon's brow furrowed in deep, uncomprehending confusion. The smug satisfaction he had briefly managed to scrape together began to slip away again. He did not understand where this conversation was heading, but he could clearly sense that he was about to be humiliated a second time. "I took that rideshare this afternoon because my personal driver was unavailable," I explained, enunciating every single word so the truth would penetrate his thick skull. "He was completely occupied on the other side of the city. He was busy driving my private security detail and transporting my luggage to the executive Arab." My mother, Vivian, let out a sharp, confused breath from across the patio. The aunts and uncles exchanged bewildered glances. The concept of an executive Arab did not compute with their rigid understanding of who I was supposed to be. They were still trying to process the revelation of my corporate empire, and now I was casually mentioning private aviation logistics. "I have a highly sensitive supply chain site visit scheduled in Texas this evening," I stated casually as if I were discussing a trip to the local grocery store. Managing a multi-million-dollar international freight firm requires a significant amount of domestic travel, and relying on the schedules of commercial airlines is a massive operational inefficiency I simply cannot afford. Chloe opened her mouth to speak, to hurl another desperate petty insult in my direction, to somehow regain the upper hand. But before she could form a single word, the atmosphere in the backyard began to change. It started as a very low, distant vibration. It was a deep, resonant frequency that seemed to travel through the ground before it registered in the air. The heavy wrought iron patio chairs trembled slightly against the stone pavers. The crystal wine glasses resting on the tables began to rattle their delicate rims, clinking together in a soft, chaotic rhythm. The family members on the patio stopped murmuring. They looked down at their feet and then cast their eyes toward the clear blue sky. The low vibration steadily transformed into a distinct rhythmic thumping sound. It was growing louder and more intense by the second, rolling over the manicured hedges and echoing through the affluent suburban neighborhood. I looked past Trevin's shoulder toward the massive, pristine swimming pool, taking up the center of the lawn. The perfectly calm surface of the water began to shudder. Tiny, aggressive ripples formed across the entire length of the pool, bouncing off the tiled edges as the heavy rhythmic thumping grew deafeningly loud. The wind began to violently pick up, tearing through the leaves of the old oak trees and whipping across the grass. The sheer force of the approaching disturbance swallowed all the remaining oxygen in the yard. I stood perfectly still, watching the dark, massive shadow begin to fall directly over my parents' estate. The shadow that swept over the manicured lawn was absolute, plunging the sunlit patio into an unexpected twilight. It moved swiftly across the expensive landscaping, swallowing the vibrant green of the grass and casting a sudden, terrifying chill over the gathering. I tilted my head upward, letting the chaotic winds whip my dress around my knees. While my family began to panic, I simply stood my ground. The rhythmic vibration that had started deep within the earth was now reverberating directly inside my chest. It was a heavy, thumping pressure that demanded total submission from everything in its path. I did not flinch. I had built a global empire by remaining calm in the center of the storm, and I was certainly not going to run for cover now. The noise grew exponentially. It transformed from a low, distant rumble into a deafening mechanical roar that completely swallowed every other sound in the neighborhood. You could not hear the neighborhood dogs barking. You could not hear the sudden car alarms going off in the distance as the vibrations rattled the street. And most importantly, you could not hear a single word of protest from my family. Their voices, the very tools they had used to manipulate, gaslight, and belittle me for decades, were completely stripped of their power. They were rendered entirely useless against the overwhelming force descending from the sky. The downdraft hit this patio like a localized hurricane. The sheer force of the wind was spectacular to witness. The pristine white table linens that my mother had so carefully selected to impress her country club friends were instantly ripped from the glass tables. They flew into the air like surrender flags, twisting and violently snapping in the artificial gale. The crystal wine glasses Chloe had been clinging to just moments before were knocked sideways. They shattered against the stone pavers, sending glittering shards of glass exploding across the patio. The heavy silver catering trays holding the brisket and potato salad were lifted and flipped over, dumping the expensive feast directly onto the perfectly manicured grass. My mother, Vivian, let out a silent shriek. I could see her mouth open in a frantic scream, but the roar of the engines drowned out whatever command she was trying to issue. She reached out desperately, trying to save a towering floral centerpiece, but the wind caught the heavy glass vase and sent it crashing to the ground. She was forced to abandon her prized possessions and duck for cover, throwing her arms over her perfectly styled hair. The flawless suburban image she had sacrificed her own daughter to protect was being systematically dismantled by gale force winds. Nature and aviation engineering were completely obliterating her carefully curated illusion. Trevin, the arrogant tech founder, who had just tried to physically intimidate me, completely lost his footing. The force of the wind hit his expensive linen suit, blowing his jacket wildly around his torso. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the wet stone. He tripped over a fallen patio chair and dropped to his knees. He threw his hands over his head in a purely instinctual posture of submission and fear. He looked incredibly small, huddled on the ground, shielding himself from a storm he could not charm his way out of. The golden child was reduced to cowering on the concrete, stripped of his title, his pride, and his stolen money. Chloe was faring no better. The intense downdraft ripped through her pristine aesthetic. She stumbled blindly, trying to navigate the slick stone pavers in her designer heels. She reached up with both hands, frantically trying to save her wide-brimmed designer sun hat from the raging wind. But the elements were ruthless. The hat was ripped violently from her grasp. I watched with quiet, intense satisfaction as the expensive accessory sailed high into the air, twisting erratically before plunging directly into the center of the swimming pool. It quickly became waterlogged, slowly sinking to the bottom of the deep end, just like her fraudulent marriage and her hollow social status. The extended family, the aunts and uncles, who had formed a tight circle to judge and condemn me just 20 minutes ago, were now scrambling for safety in a state of absolute panic. They pushed past each other, abandoning their drinks and their dignity, fleeing toward the safety of the sliding glass doors leading into the main house. Uncle Darnell tripped over a flying paper plate, while Aunt Patrice lost her designer shawl to the wind. The entire social hierarchy of our family was quite literally blown to pieces, scattered across the lawn like so much useless debris. Then the source of the devastation finally broke through the treeing. The remaining family members on the patio looked up from their cowering positions, their faces twisted in sheer terror and absolute awe. A massive, sleek, matte black private helicopter descended slowly from the clear blue sky. It looked like an apex predator stepping into a suburban petting zoo. There were no flashy commercial logos plastered on the side. There was no tacky branding to advertise its enormous value. It was purely functional, unapologetically lethal, and undeniably expensive. It was the physical manifestation of true corporate power arriving exactly on schedule. The pilot maneuvered the massive aircraft with expert precision. He hovered directly above the massive clearing of my parents' backyard, perfectly navigating the tight space between the tall oak trees and the edge of the swimming pool. The grass beneath the chopper flattened out in perfect concentric circles, bowing down to the sheer force of the rotor wash. The deafening roar of the twin turbine engines reached a fever pitch, rattling the expansive windows of the sprawling colonial house. The helicopter slowly lowered itself, the heavy landing skids hovering just inches above the ground, dominating the entire landscape and casting a long dark shadow over everything my parents held dear. The sleek matte black machine sat suspended in the air, a monolith of wealth and untouchable status that made Treven's entire existence look like child's play. And then the tinted side door of the passenger cabin began to slide open. The heavy tinted door of the passenger cabin slid backward with a smooth mechanical glide, revealing an interior that looked more like an executive boardroom than an aircraft. The inside was lined with cream-colored hand-stitched leather and polished carbon fiber, completely untouched by the chaos swirling outside. The ambient lighting glowed softly against the dark wood trim. A man dressed in a sharp dark suit wearing a professional aviation headset stepped into the open doorway. I did not look at the destroyed patio, the overturned catering tables, or the terrified people cowering on the grass. He operated with the discreet, absolute professionalism that my level of wealth commanded. He simply secured the safety tether, caught my eye, and gave a sharp, respectful nod, gesturing for me to board. I turned back to face my family one last time. The immense rotor wash was still beating down on us, whipping my dress wildly around my knees and sending stray leaves swirling through the humid air. I stood perfectly balanced, anchored by the absolute certainty of my victory. Trevan was still on his knees in the damp grass, clutching the lapels of his ruined linen jacket. His fraudulent financial ledgers were blowing across the yard like useless confetti. Chloe was shivering next to him, her arms wrapped tightly around her own shoulders, completely stripped of her usual arrogance. Her designer world had been entirely dismantled in less than 30 minutes. I raised my voice, projecting it from my diaphragm, so it would carry cleanly over the deafening roar of the twin turbine engines. Aviation logistics is just one branch of my corporate infrastructure. Trevan, I shouted, making sure every single syllable struck him like a physical blow. When you operate a global supply chain, you cannot afford to waste time sitting in commercial airport terminals, waiting for delays. I have a critical site visit scheduled at one of my primary distribution centers in Texas this evening. I manage fleets of cargo planes and cargo ships. A private helicopter is just how I avoid Atlanta traffic. I reached down and adjusted the strap of my leather tote bag. The bag that now contained the irrevocable deed to the most valuable property our family had ever owned. I looked directly into my brother's bloodshot, defeated eyes, watching the last remnants of his golden child persona bleed away into nothingness. Then I shifted my gaze to his wife, who was staring at the sleek aircraft with a mixture of raw envy and total despair. "You were right about one thing earlier, Chloe," I called out over the mechanical roar, refusing to let her off the hook. "I did not drive myself to this barbecue today, but that is only because my transportation was waiting on standby." I gave them both a tight, razor-sharp smile that contained absolutely zero warmth. "My ride is here." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mother move. Vivian had been clinging to the edge of the outdoor granite bar, her knuckles completely white against the dark stone. The reality of the situation was violently crashing down upon her. This was not just a successful business venture. This was a level of extreme elite wealth that completely dwarfed the country club fantasies she had chased her entire life. She was looking at the daughter she had mocked, belittled, and ultimately banned from her property just an hour ago. She was looking at a woman who commanded private aircraft, multinational corporate acquisitions, and a vast network of loyal employees. The sheer magnitude of my power and her own catastrophic miscalculation finally broke her fragile mind. Vivian let out a strangled, gasping breath that I could see, but not hear over the engine noise. She reached a trembling hand up to clutch her chest right over her heart. Her eyes rolled back into her head, losing focus entirely. The elitist matriarch of our family lost all consciousness. She literally collapsed, falling backward into the expensive wrought iron patio furniture before sliding into a crumpled heap on the wet stone pavers. She fainted dead away, completely overwhelmed by the undeniable proof of her own colossal failure. My father, Jerome, let out a panicked shout, and scrambled across the wet patio, dropping to his knees beside his unconscious wife. He frantically patted her cheeks, trying to wake her up, his face twisted in absolute terror. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for help, pleading for the capable, responsible daughter he had always taken for granted to step in and fix the mess. I did not rush over to help. I did not drop my bag. I did not feel a single ounce of panic or obligation. I had spent 35 years rushing to their aid only to be treated like disposable trash. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their respect, only to realize they were incapable of giving it. That cycle was officially permanently broken. I turned my back on the wreckage of my family. I walked toward the hovering helicopter, moving with steady, deliberate purpose. The aviation specialist reached down and firmly grasped my hand, helping me step up into the luxurious cabin. I settled into the plush cream leather seat, sinking into the deep comfort of my own success. The specialist handed me a state-of-the-art noise-canceling headset and slid the heavy tinted door shut, sealing me inside a quiet climate-controlled sanctuary. The deafening roar of the engines instantly faded into a dull, manageable hum. I fastened my heavy chrome seatbelt and looked out the reinforced window. The pilot smoothly increased the throttle. The helicopter began its vertical ascent, lifting effortlessly away from the ground. I looked down through the tinted glass, watching the sprawling suburban estate shrink beneath me. I saw my father desperately trying to revive my mother near the outdoor kitchen. I saw Trevon still kneeling in the grass, surrounded by his scattered lies, utterly defeated. I saw Chloe staring up at the sky, her face a mask of pure, bitter resentment as she watched her billionaire sister-in-law literally rise above her. They looked so incredibly small. The massive suburban house that had always felt like an emotional prison, a fortress of impossible expectations and relentless criticism, now looked like a tiny, insignificant toy model. The people who had tried to define my worth and limit my potential were entirely grounded, trapped in the chaotic mess they had created for themselves. They had chosen the illusion of wealth over genuine connection, and now they were left with absolutely nothing. I leaned back against the soft leather, closing my eyes for a brief moment. I felt the powerful vibration of the aircraft carrying me higher and higher into the clear blue sky. I did not look back again. I had secured my grandmother's legacy, exposed a fraud, and completely reclaimed my own narrative. The heavy, suffocating weight of their conditional love was gone forever. I was ascending, leaving the ruins of their arrogance far below me, heading toward a future that I had built entirely with my own two hands. 6 months can change the entire landscape of a person's existence. For my global logistics empire, it was simply another 2 quarters of unprecedented financial expansion and strategic corporate acquisitions. For my biological family, it was an absolute free fall into the exact working-class reality they had spent their entire lives mocking. I kept the specific terms of my legal agreement with Trevon. I did not hand his offshore embezzlement files over to the federal authorities. I did not send my older brother to a federal penitentiary, but keeping him out of handcuffs did not mean keeping him comfortable. The 10-year debt restructuring plan we signed on that patio required him to liquidate every single asset he falsely claimed to own. The sleek downtown office space he used to impress naive investors was shuttered within a single week. The building management locked the glass doors and seized all the expensive modern furniture to cover his months of unpaid rent. The luxury vehicles were the next things to disappear. The pristine white Porsche Panamera that Chloe loved to flaunt was repossessed in the middle of the night. The bank did not care about their elite social calendar. Trevon's personal bank accounts were completely drained to meet his first massive repayment installment to my firm. When the venture capital community in Atlanta realized his tech startup was nothing more than a hollow shell company, word spread like a wildfire. In the span of a few weeks, Trevon went from being the golden child of the technology scene to an absolute pariah. No legitimate investor would take his phone calls. No reputable firm would even look at his resume. He was completely blacklisted from the corporate world he had so desperately wanted to rule, and exactly as I predicted, Chloe did what any parasite does when the host runs out of blood. She detached herself and fled. She filed the divorce paperwork less than 48 hours after my helicopter ascended from that backyard. She did not hesitate to completely throw Trevon under the bus to save herself. She hired a team of ruthless attorneys paid for by her wealthy parents and painted herself as the ultimate victim. She used every ounce of her privileged white fragility to convince the judge that Trevon was a manipulative mastermind who had deceived her into signing those offshore banking documents. She stripped their remaining joint accounts, took her designer wardrobe, and moved right back into her parents' gated estate. She left Trevon with absolutely nothing. The man who had mocked my practical clothing and my rideshare was now sleeping on a cheap air mattress in a cramped studio apartment, taking the public bus to a minimum-wage warehouse job just to meet his monthly debt obligations to me. But the most profound destruction happened to my parents. Jerome and Vivian had built their entire identity around being the elite upper crust of suburban Atlanta. They genuinely believed they were untouchable royalty. But Trevon's massive liabilities dragged them straight down into the dirt. Because they had co-signed several of his earlier business loans to maintain his wealthy facade, they were held legally responsible for the financial fallout. Without my financial backing and with Trevon's complete insolvency, my parents were forced to put their sprawling manicured estate on the market. It was not a quiet, dignified sale. It was a rapid, desperate liquidation to stave off total bankruptcy. The massive backyard where they had publicly humiliated me. The patio where my mother had banned me from her life was auctioned off to the highest bidder. They had to host a public estate sale to liquidate their expensive art, their antique furniture, and the custom outdoor kitchen where the barbecue had taken place. The neighbors they had spent decades trying to impress walked through their home picking over their most prized belongings at heavy discount prices. I heard from a former associate that a neighbor actually bought the exact wrought iron patio chair my mother had fainted onto. The financial ruin was terrible, but the social isolation was the true punishment for Jerome and Vivian. In their affluent circles, reputation is the only currency that actually matters. The truth about Trevon's massive fraud became an open secret across the city. Everyone knew he had stolen from his own employees to fund a fake lifestyle. And worse, everyone in their exclusive country club found out that Vivian and Jerome had completely alienated a billionaire daughter to protect a con artist's son. The social invitations completely stopped. They were quietly asked to step down from their prestigious charity boards. The church community where they loved to flaunt their wealth suddenly treated them with cold, polite distance. They were forced to downsize to a very modest two-bedroom condo far outside the city limits, completely removed from the prestige and the privilege they craved more than oxygen. The very people they used to look down upon were now their permanent neighbors. They were forced to live the exact blue-collar lifestyle my mother had aggressively called an embarrassment. I observed all of this from a very comfortable distance. I did not gloat. I did not intervene. I simply let the natural consequences of their own arrogance dismantle their lives piece by piece. True justice does not require active participation once the dominoes begin to fall. I sat in the corner office of my high-rise headquarters, looking out through the floor to ceiling glass windows at the Atlanta skyline. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the city I now effectively helped run. My desk was made of solid, reclaimed wood, clean and completely organized. The heavy, comfortable silence of my office was occasionally broken by the soft buzzing of my smartphone resting near my keyboard. I looked down at the bright screen. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. Vivian was calling me again. It was not the first time she had reached out. Over the last 6 months, my phone would occasionally light up with desperate attempts at communication from both of my parents. They sent long, rambling text messages talking about how much they missed their daughter. They left voicemails with trembling voices begging for an opportunity to sit down and talk. They used phrases like family unity and the healing power of forgiveness. They talked about how blood is thicker than water and how we needed to come together to fix the wounds of the past. They did not want to heal anything. They were just drowning, and they desperately wanted access to my life raft. They realized that the daughter they had discarded was the only person capable of rescuing them from the social and financial abyss they had dug for themselves. They were hoping that the vulnerable young girl who used to desperately crave their approval was still alive somewhere inside me, waiting to be called back home. I watched the phone vibrate against the dark wood of my desk. I watched my mother's name flash across the screen again and again. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel the urge to answer and demand an apology. I did not need to hear her cry or listen to my father beg for a second chance. Their pain was entirely of their own making, and their redemption was not my responsibility. The phone stopped buzzing. A moment later, a notification appeared on the screen indicating a new voicemail had been left. I reached out and picked up the device. I unlocked the screen and navigated to the voicemail inbox. I saw the automatic transcription of my mother's weeping voice pleading for just 5 minutes of my time. I did not press play. I did not listen to a single second of her theatrical performance. With one smooth, deliberate motion, I swiped left across the notification. I tapped the red delete button. The message vanished, permanently erased from my device and from my life. I set the phone back down on my desk, completely unfazed, and turned my attention back to the quarterly acquisition reports, waiting for my approval. I pushed the quarterly acquisition reports to the far corner of my solid oak desk and reached for the large leather-bound portfolio resting beneath them. Inside were not financial ledgers or corporate buyout contracts, but detailed architectural blueprints. They were the finalized construction plans for the downtown commercial lot that used to belong to my grandmother. The heavy paper was covered in crisp white lines detailing a complete architectural transformation. The construction crews had officially completed the primary renovations earlier that morning, bringing a vision I had held for years into absolute reality. Trevon had always looked at that prime piece of Atlanta real estate and seen nothing but a quick, effortless cash grab. He had actively lobbied our parents for years to bulldoze the historic brick buildings and sell the raw dirt to luxury condominium developers. He wanted to pave over our grandmother's hard work just to inject quick liquidity into his fraudulent tech startup and fund Chloe's designer lifestyle. My parents had fully supported his destructive vision because they valued the appearance of elite wealth over actual substance. I saw something entirely different. I saw the exact same raw potential my grandmother saw when she purchased that land decades ago. I did not sell a single square foot of the property to developers. Instead, I poured millions of dollars of my own liquid capital into completely restoring the block. I retained the beautiful historic brick facades but gutted the interiors, transforming the entire property into a state-of-the-art community hub and logistics incubator. I built modern warehouse spaces, loading docks, and high-tech dispatch centers specifically designed to support young working-class Black entrepreneurs. These were ambitious men and women who were grinding through the exact same grueling blue-collar reality I had survived. They were independent truck drivers, freight dispatchers, and warehouse managers who possessed incredible operational skills, but were routinely denied commercial loans by traditional banks. They were shut out of the corporate world because they lacked the polished elite pedigree and the country club connections my parents valued so obsessively. I gave them the exact infrastructure they needed to scale their businesses. I provided the legal resources, the commercial vehicle parking, and the direct technological access to global supply chains that would allow them to build true generational wealth. I established a grant program within the incubator, fully funded by my parent company, to ensure that no talented logistics professional would ever have to sleep in the cab of a box truck just to keep their business afloat. By refusing to sign those forged bank documents on my parents' patio, I had not just saved myself from a federal fraud indictment. I had protected the real legacy of my family, the true legacy of hard work, quiet resilience, and community empowerment that my parents and brother had completely abandoned in their desperate, pathetic climb up the social ladder. A soft knock at the heavy glass door of my office pulled me from my thoughts. My chief operating officer stepped into the room holding a secure digital tablet. He informed me that the executive team was fully assembled and ready to begin the evening strategy session. I closed the portfolio of blueprints, feeling a deep, profound warmth in my chest. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my tailored suit jacket, and walked toward the door. I walked down the quiet carpeted hallway and stepped into the main boardroom of my high-rise headquarters. The panoramic glass windows offered a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the Atlanta skyline, completely illuminated against the dark night sky. The city stretched out below me, a vast network of continuous movement and commerce that my company actively helped control and sustain. I took my seat at the head of the long, polished conference table. I looked around the room at the faces of my executive team. They were brilliant, relentless, and incredibly loyal professionals who operated at the absolute highest levels of global finance. None of them cared about my family background. None of them judged me for starting my career in a used delivery truck wearing work boots and a high-visibility vest. They respected me because I had earned my position at the head of the table through undeniable results, fierce intelligence, and absolute integrity. I thought back to that humid afternoon in my parents' sprawling backyard. I remembered the suffocating weight of their conditional love and the casual, unapologetic cruelty they threw in my face. They genuinely believed they could force me into total submission because they thought family loyalty meant accepting whatever abuse they decided to hand out. They thought they could sit at a picnic table, feed me scraps, and demand my absolute obedience to protect their fragile illusions. They were catastrophically wrong. My parents and my brother lost their wealth, their social status, and their entire elite world because they built their existence on a foundation of lies and arrogance. They chose to worship a golden child who was nothing more than a parasite. I kept my peace and my power because I built my world on an unshakable foundation of truth and relentless hard work. I faced the absolute worst of their betrayal, and I did not let it break me. I used it as the final catalyst to sever the chains that had held me back for 35 years. I opened the executive dossier placed in front of me, ready to finalize our next massive international acquisition. I felt a profound sense of clarity and ultimate freedom settling deep into my bones. The long, painful journey from a discarded delivery driver to a logistics billionaire had taught me the most valuable lesson of my entire life. Respect is never something you beg for at a family picnic table while they try to make you feel incredibly small. It is not something you inherit through a country club membership or fake by leasing a luxury car you cannot actually afford. Respect is something you build brick by brick with your own two hands. It is an empire you own outright. And when the time comes, it is something you command directly from the sky. The ultimate lesson from this journey is that your true worth is never defined by the people who try to keep you small. For years, I believed that if I just worked hard enough or proved myself, my family would finally grant me the respect and love I deserved. But toxic dynamics are built on control, not connection. When a family chooses to worship an illusion of success while punishing genuine, quiet, hard work, you cannot fix them by playing their game. You have to walk away and build your own table. True power does not require validation from those who are committed to misunderstanding you. It requires the courage to step into the dark, embrace the grueling work that others look down upon, and construct a life built on absolute truth and integrity. I learned that you cannot save people from the natural consequences of their own arrogance, and you certainly should not set yourself on fire to keep their illusions warm. Independence is the ultimate shield against manipulation. Once you realize that you own your narrative, you stop begging for a seat at a broken table and start commanding the respect you built with your own two hands. Share your story in the comments below and hit subscribe. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic family expectations to build your own independent empire,